Yeah, hi, my name's Neil Sykes, 49, born and bred in Brighton. Been in and around the mod scene most of my life. The main involvement came from around 1979 when, unbeknown to myself, I managed to get a walk-on part in the now iconic film called Quadrophenia as a young boy. I think growing up as a mod in Brighton is very, very different to it is today. It was a much smaller scene. It was part of what they called the mod revival in the late 70s, early 80s, which was still very much based on the original scene and the original style, but on a very, very much smaller scale. It kind of took off with the likes of Paul Weller and the Jam, and died out a bit when the Jam died off in 1982. So they were, they were probably the pinnacle of the mod revival, but overall the scene's never really changed. It's a much bigger scene today than it was back in the 80s, but probably not as big a scene today as it was back in the 1960s. Actually going up in Brighton, I guess was the fillip for me to always be a mod, because of the history with Brighton, with Quadrophenia, and with the mods and rockers, of course. Just touching base with the mods and the rockers, which to me should be championed just as much as the mods, really, because it was about the mods and rockers. It was about the fights back in the 60s. The film Quadrophenia was mods and rockers, so to me the rockers get left out of all this a little bit, but good in a way because I'm a mod. So, but that's a little bit conceited. Where we're standing today, filming on the forecourt of the Palace Pier, which thankfully is now called Brighton Pier, as it was back in the day. It's very poignant on many levels. It had a fairly big part to play in the film Quadrophenia, with the scene where the mod wakes up with the rockers in the morning after having nowhere to sleep at night. That was in one of the arches, standing pretty much, we're pretty much standing on top of that right now. So it's one of the arches underneath the pier. Also, it's another fact that Pete Townshend, the opening tracks to the album Quadrophenia, you can hear the waves lapping fairly clearly, and it was recorded by Pete Townshend himself underneath this very pier that we're standing on right now. So it's got many, many links to the actual history of the mods and rockers scene in total. As for mods and rockers itself, there's many people that say, what are your opinion about the rockers and the mods? Well, I guess in many ways there wouldn't be an actual scene without the rockers in the first place, because in the late 50s it was the rockers that brought the first Lambrettas into the UK, and they then decided they weren't fast enough or powerful enough for their needs, if you like. So they started handing them on to a new group of individuals which were just starting to grow, mainly in North London, but a little bit in the West End of London around that time, wearing suits, etc., and wanting to be a bit more stylish rather than speed. And that's how the mods started riding scooters. So they were actually brought in by the rockers, and mods evolved into the scooter boys. Just a little bit of history about the mods and rockers itself, which I said, to me, they should both be championed as being part of the culture and the actual values of the history of the whole scene, and the Brighton part of the scene as well. I think it goes back to the early days where it was the powerful engines against the so-called hairdryers, as the rockers call it, and it was the rockers that always used to get frustrated because they felt they were held up by these big groups of scooter boys coming down to Brighton for the bank holidays, and that's part of where the clash started. A bit of the clothing and a bit of the style would have been involved in the disputes, I guess, back in the day. That side's mostly died off now because it's mostly like an aging scene with the mods and rockers, but there's still a little bit of that flavour that does exist today. We've led, as a group, we've led the Brighton Marathon around the streets of Brighton for the last 7 years. First couple of years it was just the scooters only. That's now evolved to having us and some minis following behind, and a few other vehicles here and there. Also, a group of Harley Davidsons follow for the last 3 years. It didn't happen this year because we had to sort it out last year, but what happened on the start line was the Harleys almost refused to do the cavalcade unless they could lead the scooters round. Now, that goes back to the history where they always thought they should be in front, but that didn't happen, and being Brighton, it should be scooters all the way. There's no clash or conflict between anyone, but it just gives you a little insight into, I guess, both sides of it think they're better than the others, so they always want to be seen to be first and in front. and it was always the rockers that never got their own way, which would have potentially back in the day been a little part of the clashes that took on in Margate and here, of course, in Brighton Seafront.